Opening up diagonals for the queen and bishop immediately creates dynamic central influence. Instantly contesting central space, this Sicilian defense sets up a complex, imbalanced battleground where queenside play often proves decisive. Developing the knight here prepares to contest the center and opens lines for queen and bishop activity. Solidifying the center and preparing for the pawn's advance, this move embraces the classical Sicilian defense. Challenging the center immediately, this thrust opens lines and forces black to decide how to handle the pawn tension. Opening the center with this exchange immediately sets up a dynamic struggle for central control and pawn majority potential. Nabbing the pawn with the knight immediately seizes central space and opens lines for further development, aiming to out-accelerate black's pawn structure. Developing a knight here prepares to challenge white's central pawn and opens lines for further piece activity, setting up a dynamic middle game. Developing a knight to c3 solidifies central control and prepares for potential kingside expansion. Preparing a queenside pawn lever, this move aims to restrict white's knight and prepare the b5 advance for queenside expansion. Unleashing a bishop's diagonal power, this piece aims to dominate the long light-squared diagonal, directly eyeing black's potentially vulnerable f7 square, creating immediate tactical possibilities and putting pressure on black's developing pieces. Preparing a structural response to white's bishop on c4 while simultaneously opening a diagonal for black's queen is a sound, flexible maneuver. This choice prioritizes solidifying the center and delaying any immediate kingside complications, a hallmark of a positional approach. Retreating the bishop to a safer diagonal after the pawn push maintains pressure on the queen side and prepares for castling, while also avoiding immediate exchanges and keeping options open for future pawn breaks. Expanding aggressively on the queen side, this pawn thrust seeks to gain vital space and potentially dislodge white's light-squared bishop, while simultaneously preparing to activate the queenside rook. Embracing a bold, forward thrust, white immediately challenges the pawn chain and seeks to dominate the kingside, potentially opening lines for a swift assault by pushing the e-pawn next. Reinforcing the central pawn chain and preparing for a potential pawn storm on the kingside, this bishop's relocation to b7 now actively challenges white's d4 knight and aims to control the long diagonal, subtly influencing the center while keeping options open. Igniting a pawn storm on the kingside, white aggressively sacrifices a pawn to rip open lines and challenge black's king's safety, demanding immediate tactical awareness and a robust defensive setup from the opponent. Asserting central space, black aims to stabilize their pawn structure and prevent white's aggressive knight advance, preparing for a potential queenside expansion. Securing the knight on e2 offers a flexible retreat from the central pawn storm, preparing to reinforce the kingside and potentially launch an attack down the f-file while keeping an eye on the ever-expanding queenside space black is claiming with the b-pawn. Developing the knight to d7 is a sensible regrouping, preparing to challenge white's central pawns and potentially activate the queen's bishop by castling kingside, while also offering flexibility for future pawn pushes like d5. Sharpening the attack, white immediately pressures black's knight on f6, forcing a decision and potentially opening lines if black doesn't respond carefully to this double-edged pin. Unburdening the queen's diagonal, this piece seeks to consolidate defensive resources and prepare for potential central pawn pushes, potentially aiming for a safer setup before engaging in further confrontation. Shifting the knight to g3 solidifies control of the kingside while preparing for potential advances and offering support to the f4 pawn, subtly tightening white's grip on the center and preventing black's immediate kingside expansion. Securing the crucial c-file with the rook on c8 signals black's intent to challenge white's central pawn structure and establish active piece play along the open corridor, preparing for potential breakthroughs and a more dynamic pawn storm on the queen side. Castling kingside establishes a secure haven for the monarch, strategically centralizing the king's defense behind a robust pawn shield while simultaneously preparing to connect the rooks for future operations along the open files. Unleashing the king's pawn, black disrupts white's comfortable central pawn chain and aims to seize the initiative by creating immediate attacking threats on the king side. This maneuver directly confronts black's ambitious pawn storm on the queen side, aiming to limit its scope and reinforce white's kingside initiative. By advancing the h-pawn, white seeks to prevent black's bishop from finding an ideal diagonal and simultaneously creates a defensive shield for its own king, potentially preparing a kingside attack or a retreat if necessary. It's a bold decision that opens up the h-file, though it also slightly weakens white's own pawn structure in the long run. Black decisively seizes the initiative on the queen side, injecting immediate dynamism into the pawn structure and forcing white to confront a new spatial challenge before solidifying their own kingside attack. Shattering the pawn chain creates a dynamic imbalance, opening lines and forcing black to reassess their defensive structure. The bishop's sacrifice on f6, immediately recaptured, reshapes the pawn structure dramatically, creating an isolated d-pawn for black while opening the g-file for white's rook, a potential storm brewing towards the black king. This exchange fundamentally alters the positional landscape, introducing dynamic imbalances and tactical opportunities that will define the ensuing middle game battle. Seizing the central outpost with this knight creates immediate pressure, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially force concessions. Hoping to exploit the temporarily open h-file, black gambits a piece to disrupt white's kingside structure and open diagonals, a bold attempt to seize the initiative and create counterplay against the uncastled monarch. Sacrificing a knight to expose the black king is a bold, aggressive gamble, aiming to exploit the open diagonals now available. The black queen, now exposed on g5, initiates a daring counterattack, seeking to exploit white's somewhat overextended pawn structure and the latent threats around his castled king, aiming to disrupt white's initiative. Igniting a storm on the king side, white sacrifices pawn structure for immediate attacking pressure, aiming to pry open the black king's defenses before black can consolidate. The pawn advance on g6, while seemingly a defense against the knight's threat, fundamentally weakens the kingside structure by creating permanent light square vulnerabilities. This seemingly solid move unfortunately opens up dangerous diagonals for white's bishops, particularly the one now aimed directly at the weakened king's defense. Consider how this creates a potential playground for white's pieces in the future, especially if the central pawns become locked. This is a significant positional compromise for black, offering white long-term attacking prospects. The king's square becomes a minefield as white boldly sacrifices material to pry open black's defenses, aiming to exploit the newly exposed diagonals and files leading to the monarch. This aggressive thrust transforms the game into a sharp tactical struggle, demanding precise calculation and a deep understanding of attacking patterns. The king, abandoning its cozy shelter and venturing into the open, now confronts a very precarious existence. Unleashing a relentless attack, white aims to exploit the precarious state of black's king, forcing a defensive scramble by offering a tactical trade that might open up even more avenues for disruption. A desperate attempt to stir up counterplay, but it leaves the king's defenses in disarray and ignores the encroaching threats along the open files. Finally, white looks to leverage the open f-file and the exposed black king with this queen repositioning, preparing to bring more firepower to bear on the king side. The monarch's sanctuary is breached by a daring bishop's foray, exposing the king to immediate peril and forcing a defensive scramble. The monarch is finally repositioned, a necessary retreat to escape the immediate tempest and find a safer haven from the relentless pressure on the king side. A moment of strategic recalibration, seeking to consolidate defensive resources and re-establish a coherent structure before the storm breaks anew, possibly aiming to activate the rook on f3 and exploit any lingering weaknesses in black's now exposed king's position. Black bravely brings the knight to a central outpost, aiming to disrupt white's attacking structure and potentially exploit the exposed king. The rook ventures to the third rank, a bold gambit aiming to disrupt black's burgeoning queenside pressure and potentially force a confrontation. This maneuver reasserts white's presence on the kingside, signaling an intent to pry open lines that might otherwise become black's domain. Consider how this rook's placement now influences the dynamics of the f-file and its potential support for attacking initiatives, even if it appears to temporarily abandon the defense of the king. Black embraces the chaos, steering the action towards the vulnerable white king, aiming to overload the queenside defense and exploit the bishop pair's potential for a swift assault. Injecting queen power along the third rank to threaten mate and initiate a direct attack on the exposed black king. Sacrificing the knight opens a vital diagonal for the queen, but the immediate consequences of removing white's central knight are immense. Black now has a clear target on g7, a square currently defended by a single knight that is now exposed. This exchange creates a complex tactical scenario where the safety of white's king becomes a paramount concern, as the queen and knight combination on the king side is potent. The central pawn structure is now less critical than the immediate threats brewing. Cracking open the queenside file with that pawn thrust finally gives white a tangible advantage on the flank, forcing black to confront the immediate threat of exposed pieces and potential pawn structure weaknesses, especially after the dramatic exchange of bishops. The opened file now becomes a critical strategic battleground, and white's rook will soon vie for supremacy there. Embracing chaos, this capture ignites a wild tactical sequence, transforming a somewhat balanced Sicilian into a desperate race against time. The immediate removal of a key defender opens lines towards white's monarch, but simultaneously exposes black's own king to a searing counterattack. This is less about positional advantage and more about creating immediate, tangible threats, forcing white to react defensively rather than pursue their prior attacking ambitions. Consider the resulting open diagonals and the exposed nature of both royal families. Black's queen is now severely compromised, having ventured deep into white's territory and exposed her to significant threats. The subsequent rook sacrifice has opened lines for white's remaining pieces to converge on the black king, creating a dangerous tactical web where the queen's safety is paramount and its current position is anything but secure. Black's counterinitiative ignites a wild material imbalance, forcing white's queen into a precarious defensive position and potentially opening the long diagonal for the dark-squared bishop. Unlocking the e-file offers white a much-needed open avenue for their rook, potentially creating immediate threats against black's somewhat exposed king. A bold check that forces the opponent's king into a precarious central position, disrupting black's potential for a swift king hunt and exposing the black king to further threats, while simultaneously simplifying the material and potentially steering towards an endgame where white's past pawn advantage might become more pronounced. Relocating the king to the first rank initiates a vital defensive maneuver, shoring up the weakened kingside and preparing to contest the newly opened central files, aiming to neutralize black's active bishop and potentially exploit the exposed enemy monarch. A bold attempt to reignite the central conflict by rerouting the queen, aiming to exploit the slightly exposed white king and disrupt white's coordination.